The early morning light filtered softly through the rustling leaves of a nearby tree, casting long shadows on the bustling city streets. A warm breeze carried the sounds of street vendors calling out their goods, and the scent of freshly baked bread wafted through the air. It was just another ordinary Tuesday in the heart of downtown, where people shuffled from one task to the next without much thought, each caught in their own world. Among the crowd, an elderly woman shuffled slowly into a small local market. Her steps were deliberate, steady, but not without effort. She was thin, her back slightly hunched from the years, and her weathered hands gripped the edge of a worn leather purse. She had seen the world change over the decades, but she still found comfort in the simple act of shopping at this particular market, a place she had frequented for years. She wasn't rich, nor did she expect to be, but she had lived a life rich in experiences, and every coin she spent on a loaf of bread, or some fresh vegetables, felt like a small victory in the grand scheme of things. The market was crowded this morning, like most mornings. People rushed to get their groceries, eyeing items they needed for the day, some haggling with the vendors, others simply grabbing what they could and moving on. The hum of conversation and clinking of coins filled the air. At the checkout counter, a young man, Mark, stood with his arms crossed, his eyes scanning the growing line of customers. He worked at the market as a cashier, though his demeanor suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Tall, with a sharply cut jawline and a sense of arrogance that oozed from every pore, Mark didn't have much patience for the customers who came through. He was bored, disinterested, and to be honest, a little bitter about his job. The elderly woman approached his counter, her slow, deliberate steps betraying her age. She reached into her purse, carefully pulling out a handful of coins. Old silver, worn pennies, some nickels and dimes. The kind of change that might seem insignificant to most, but to her, each coin held value. Mark looked at her and sighed internally, rolling his eyes as she slowly counted the coins in her palm. "Ma'am," he said with an exaggerated sigh, his voice laced with impatience. "You're really going to pay with all that change? Come on. There's a line, and I don't have all day." He wasn't trying to hide the contempt in his voice. The old woman's hands trembled slightly as she continued to count. She wasn't in a rush. She had all the time in the world. "I'm sorry, dear. I don't mean to hold you up. I just want to make sure I have enough," she replied quietly, her voice soft but steady. Mark's patience was wearing thin. He clicked his tongue and leaned against the counter, his posture becoming more dismissive as he stared at the old woman with distaste. The customers behind her began to shift uncomfortably, muttering under their breath. The woman's presence, her slow movements, the clinking of the coins, it all felt like a nuisance to him. Just then, the bell above the door jingled, and in walked none other than Tom Cruise. He was dressed casually, blending in with the crowd, but anyone who had ever seen a movie knew who he was. A few people in the store recognized him immediately, their eyes widening, but they didn't say anything. He wasn't making a scene, he was just another customer. The people around him murmured quietly amongst themselves, but their eyes were glued to the celebrity, wondering if he was truly who they thought he was. Tom stood at the back of the line, a few steps away from the elderly woman. He was casually looking around, as if he didn't have a care in the world, but his mind was sharp, observing everything with an almost intuitive sense of awareness. He noticed the tension at the counter, and the impatient looks being cast toward the elderly woman. He saw how Mark's eyes were rolling, how the old woman's hands shook under the pressure. Mark's impatience was now clear to everyone, his eyes narrowing as he muttered, "Really? You've got to be kidding me with this." The woman's hands faltered as she continued to count the change, her face flushed with embarrassment. She had no idea that all eyes were on her, no idea that she was about to be caught in a situation far beyond her control. Her heart raced, her fingers fumbling, each coin a reminder of her struggle to make ends meet in a world that often overlooked people like her. But it wasn't just the old woman's situation that had caught Tom's attention. It was the way the young man was treating her. He hadn't seen this level of disrespect in a while, and something in his gut told him this moment wasn't going to end well unless someone stepped in. Little did Mark know, the next person in line wasn't just another customer. Tom stood quietly in line, observing the scene before him. There was a subtle tension in the air, a weight that hung around the elderly woman and her slow, deliberate counting of coins. The market, with its busy hustle and bustle, had paused for a moment around her. Tom could see that the woman was not just old, but was deeply rooted in a lifetime of dignity, trying to hold on to the little she had. Every coin she was counting felt like it held years of hard work and sacrifice. Behind him, a young man shifted impatiently. The line had gotten longer now, and people were starting to exchange looks. There were whispers about the old woman holding up the queue. It wasn't that people were particularly rude, but rather that impatience in the world had become a subtle but powerful force. Mark, the cashier, stood with his arms crossed, waiting for the elderly woman to finish. His eyes rolled upward, clearly frustrated, but he didn't move to help her. He was already thinking about his plans for the evening. A night out with friends, some drinks, maybe a few laughs. He had no patience for anything else, especially not for this old woman, who seemed to exist in another era. One where time wasn't so precious. One where people could afford to linger in moments. He hadn't always been this way, Mark thought, as he watched the coins pile up slowly on the counter. When he first started at this market, he'd been enthusiastic, trying to get along with everyone, working hard to make a name for himself. But over time, it became clear to him that no one really cared. The customers came in, got their goods and left. He was just a cog in the wheel. And that's when his indifference took hold. No one was going to remember his face, and no one really mattered. People like the old woman, they didn't fit into his world. They just got in the way. Mark shifted his gaze, sneering as the woman fumbled with her change, the coins falling to the counter in a small clink. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for a few people nearby to hear. But the elderly woman didn't notice. Her focus was entirely on her change, trying to make sure she had enough for the loaf of bread she had planned to buy. She didn't see the judgment in his eyes. All she could feel was the pressure of the moment, the sting of being old, and not having what others took for granted. Behind her, Tom felt his anger begin to rise. He wasn't a man who liked confrontation, but something about the way Mark was treating the old woman rubbed him the wrong way. He hadn't been in this situation before, but something about this felt wrong. She wasn't some obstacle to be moved out of the way. She was a person, deserving of respect. And then there was the look on the woman's face, her cheeks flushed with the embarrassment of being the subject of ridicule. It reminded Tom of his mother, who had lived through her own struggles, always trying to make ends meet. His mother had taught him the value of respect and kindness, no matter who the person was. It was how she had raised him, to see every individual as equal, to never let someone be made to feel less than they were. His thoughts were interrupted by Mark's voice, louder this time. "Ma'am, if you're not going to hurry up, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. There's a line, and I have work to do." Mark's words were harsh, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. The young man's voice, though not loud, carried a condescending tone that made the elderly woman flinch. Tom could see it clearly now. Mark wasn't just impatient, he was belittling her. The line had grown longer, and the crowd was starting to shift uncomfortably. More people glanced at the elderly woman, who was clearly struggling, her fingers trembling as she counted the last of her coins. It felt as if time had slowed, and with each passing second, the tension in the air grew thicker. Tom glanced at the other customers in line. Some of them looked away, pretending they hadn't heard Mark's words. Others seemed sympathetic, but no one said anything. It was as if they were all just waiting for something to happen, but no one wanted to be the one to step in. They were all trapped in their own routines, too afraid or too busy to make a stand. And that's when Tom realized something. He couldn't just stand by. He wasn't going to let this happen. Not while he was here. He took a step forward, his calm, measured footsteps a stark contrast to the rising tension in the store. The elderly woman, still unaware of Tom's presence, continued counting her change, unaware of the storm brewing behind her. Mark's eyes were now fixed on her, irritated, his patience worn thin. Tom's voice was calm, but firm as he addressed Mark. "Excuse me, I think that's enough." Mark glanced at him, momentarily taken aback by the interruption. He raised an eyebrow, his face dripping with condescension. "And who are you exactly?" he asked, looking Tom up and down. Some kind of hero? I'm just a guy who doesn't like seeing others treated like that, Tom replied evenly. He wasn't angry, but there was a quiet intensity in his tone. It wasn't a threat, but it was a statement. Mark sneered, ready to respond, but he didn't get the chance. A few people behind Tom were starting to murmur, some nodding their heads in agreement. The weight of the situation had finally become too much to ignore. For the first time, the room seemed to fall silent. Mark was caught off guard. His bravado faltered, just for a moment. Tom's simple words had done what the crowd couldn't, made them realize that they were witnessing an injustice unfold before them. Mark's eyes flicked back to the elderly woman, who was still unaware of the confrontation taking place behind her. Her hands, shaking slightly, placed the last coin on the counter. She looked up at Mark, finally meeting his gaze, but she didn't know what was happening in the moment. All she knew was that she had done her best. But what Mark didn't know, and what none of the customers had realized yet, was that the story was about to take an unexpected turn. Tom Cruise, the man standing in line behind the elderly woman, wasn't just a regular customer. He was about to change everything. The air in the market seemed to freeze as Tom Cruise stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. It wasn't the tone of a man about to cause trouble, but rather the voice of someone who had seen enough and wasn't willing to stand by any longer. Mark, the young cashier, seemed taken aback for a moment, his posture momentarily stiffening as he looked Tom up and down. A second of confusion passed over his face before he forced a smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Oh, I see," Mark said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "We've got ourselves a big shot, huh? Is that what this is about?" He leaned in a little closer, sizing up Tom with a look that suggested a mix of mockery and bravado. "Maybe you should let the old lady finish her transaction. She seems to have it under control." Tom didn't flinch. His eyes were calm, calculating. He wasn't interested in playing games with this man. Mark's words were meant to provoke. It was clear from the way he looked at Tom, the quick judgment that came with the arrogance of youth. He was used to getting away with his rudeness. He was used to being the one in control. And now he was faced with a challenge. The crowd that had gathered around the counter, having been swept into the tension of the moment, was waiting for something. They weren't sure what exactly, but the unease in the air was palpable. "Listen, man," Mark continued, trying to maintain his cool. "I'm just doing my job. I'm not a babysitter. If she can't figure out how to pay, that's on her. We're all busy." Tom's gaze never wavered. The crowd around him seemed to hold their breath, waiting for a reaction. He could sense the pressure mounting, the subtle shift from awkwardness to anger. People didn't want to see an old woman humiliated, but they didn't know what to do about it. It was one of those situations where everyone knew what was right, but no one was willing to step in. The elderly woman, unaware of the tension unfolding around her, continued counting her coins slowly, her face flushed with concentration. She had no idea who Tom was, nor did she care. She was just trying to get through the transaction, a small, mundane task that had become a moment of unbearable pressure. But Tom wasn't going to let this moment slip by. He stepped closer to the counter, his presence suddenly more commanding, though still calm. "Mark," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "She's not the problem here. You are." Mark's smile faltered for a split second, and then it came back, this time with an edge of defensiveness. "What's your deal, man?" he snapped. "You're not even supposed to be involved here. She's the one holding up the line, not me." The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath. No one had expected a confrontation, but now it was happening right in front of them. Mark's arrogance was unmistakable, his refusal to back down almost palpable. He was trying to assert his dominance over the situation, but Tom's calm demeanor was starting to undermine his authority. Tom took a step closer, his gaze unflinching. "No one's holding up the line except you. You're the one being rude. And if you don't want to show respect to someone who's just trying to get by, then maybe you need to reevaluate what you're doing here." Mark's hands clenched at his sides. His jaw tightened. The words Tom had spoken were direct, cutting through his defensiveness like a knife. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not like this. His mind raced for a retort, something that would make him look in control again, but nothing came. Instead, He looked at the elderly woman once more, still oblivious to the exchange unfolding before her. Her trembling hands finished counting the last of her coins, placing them on the counter, and she looked up, her eyes wide with worry. "I think that should be enough," she said softly, still unaware of the battle that was taking place around her. "I'm sorry if I've made things difficult." Mark, his irritation growing, grabbed the coins from the counter and shoved them into the cash register. "It's fine," he muttered, barely acknowledging her apology. "Just move along." Next, the words hung in the air like a slap. The woman flinched slightly, but she didn't say anything. She simply took her bread, gathered her change, and turned to leave. There was no dignity left in the moment. Not for her anyway. Mark had reduced her to an inconvenience. Her small purchase, the few coins she had worked so hard for, had been devalued by his condescension. Tom's heart ached for her, but he wasn't about to let the moment go unchallenged. He had to do something, not just for the woman, but for everyone who had silently witnessed the injustice. But there was a problem. Mark wasn't the only one who had made a misstep. As the elderly woman began to leave, the crowd shifted uneasily, still unsure how to respond to the scene that had unfolded. Tom felt a sudden pull in his gut. The woman was leaving, defeated, her pride crushed, but something needed to be done to right this wrong. He couldn't just let it slide. But that wasn't the only issue at hand. Mark hadn't expected Tom to stand up to him. He hadn't expected Tom to be anyone worth paying attention to. The young cashier, now flustered and angry, snapped his gaze back at Tom. "Are you trying to make me look bad in front of everyone?" Mark barked, stepping forward, getting into Tom's personal space. "What? You think you can just come in here and start telling me how to do my job? I don't care who you are." Tom didn't flinch. He stood his ground, but the air around them was crackling with tension. The crowd had begun to murmur more loudly now, their curiosity piqued. Some had started to whisper, trying to figure out who Tom really was. A few had recognized him by now. Some had made the connection, but they were too nervous to speak up. Tom could see that Mark wasn't just an arrogant cashier anymore. He was a man on the defensive, and in his desperation to save face, Mark was about to escalate the conflict. He needed to handle this carefully. The challenge wasn't just about standing up to Mark anymore. It was about navigating the delicate balance between confrontation and resolution. If Tom pushed too hard, it could turn into a spectacle, one that could end with him looking just as bad as Mark. But if he let Mark get away with it, the message would be even worse. That cruelty could go unchallenged, that a person's dignity didn't matter in the face of a few coins. And so, in this moment, the central conflict was not only between Mark and Tom. It was a battle for respect, for standing up when it seemed easiest to stay silent, for showing others that no one was insignificant. Tom had a decision to make, and it wasn't one he would take lightly. But one thing was for certain, this moment was far from over. The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. The once innocuous scene in the market now transformed into a battleground of pride and principles. The crowd's whispers grew louder as they watched, some unsure whether to intervene, others too nervous to take sides. Mark's defiance was unmistakable. He stood there, arms crossed, his chest puffed out as he tried to assert dominance over the situation. The young cashier had long abandoned his professional facade. This wasn't about the job anymore. This was about winning. About proving that he was in control, even if that meant humiliating an elderly woman who had simply tried to make her purchase. Tom's eyes never left Mark's, though he could feel the weight of the murmuring crowd around them. His heart beat steadily, but there was a tightening in his chest, a feeling that he had to act quickly before the situation spiraled further. "You're making a mistake, Mark," Tom said calmly, his words almost cutting through the growing tension like a blade. "This isn't about you being in charge. This is about respect. You're in a position where you're supposed to make people feel seen and valued, not ridiculed." Mark's smile faltered again, his jaw tightening. The words had hit too close to home. He hadn't thought of it that way, hadn't considered the people who walked through his line as anything other than nuisances to be processed. He was so focused on himself, on his petty victories, that he hadn't noticed the way people began to look at him. His arrogance, once a shield, was now becoming a glaring vulnerability. I don't need a lecture from you, Mark snapped, trying to keep his voice steady, but failing to mask the anger creeping into his tone. Who are you anyway? You think you can come in here and tell me how to do my job? You don't even know how hard it is dealing with people like that. He gestured toward the elderly woman, who was now exiting the store, her head slightly lowered, her dignity slowly eroding with every step she took. The image of her vulnerability stung Tom more than he expected. He knew he couldn't just stand there and watch as the injustice went unchallenged. But how far could he push it without making things worse? Tom took a deep breath, his mind racing as he assessed the scene. This was no longer just about Mark's mistreatment of the woman. It was about the way he'd misjudged her, and everyone else in the room for that matter. It was about the way people often mistreated others based on what they saw on the surface. And Tom had no intention of letting that lesson go unnoticed. Your job, Tom said softly, but with unwavering conviction, isn't just to check out groceries and ring up sales. It's about understanding that people are more than the number of coins in their pockets, or the way they look. Mark looked like he was about to retort when something unexpected happened. A voice broke through the tension in the air, a familiar one. Tom. Tom turned, surprised to hear his name spoken so casually in the middle of this escalating exchange. His face softened as he saw who it was. Standing just a few feet away, unnoticed by everyone else, was a man in his late 30s, wearing a wrinkled suit and holding a stack of paperwork. He was a businessman, someone Tom had known from several charity events over the years. Daniel, Tom said, momentarily distracted. What are you doing here? Daniel smiled, stepping forward with an air of genuine curiosity. Just picking up some lunch, but it seems like I missed quite the show. His eyes moved between Tom and Mark, a subtle smirk playing at the corners of his lips. What's going on? Tom didn't break eye contact with Mark as he spoke. This guy seems to think it's okay to humiliate people just because they don't fit his idea of what a customer should look like. Mark, sensing the shift, turned to face Daniel, trying to regain control of the situation. Who's this? He asked, trying to act dismissive but failing. Another one of your friends? Should I be worried about getting lectured by him too? Daniel's smile faltered for a moment as he sized up Mark. He glanced at Tom, then back at the cashier, his expression shifting from mild amusement to something sharper, more discerning. You know, he said slowly, his voice carrying a quiet authority. Sometimes the real test of who you are comes not when you're at the top, but when you're on the ground, dealing with people who can't fight back. And from what I see here, you're failing that test. The words hit Mark like a punch. He blinked, taken aback by the unexpected challenge. This wasn't some random customer or passersby. This was someone with influence, someone who could easily make his life difficult if he wanted to. Mark could sense the shift in the room now. The crowd that had been quietly observing was suddenly watching him more closely. The air was thick with judgment, and Mark, who had once prided himself on his ability to control situations, was no longer in command. Tom, however, remained calm, the fire in his eyes unrelenting. He could feel the change in the atmosphere. The way people were starting to understand that they weren't just watching an argument between two men. They were witnessing something much larger. This wasn't just about Mark or even the elderly woman. This was about challenging the way people treated others based on their assumptions and biases. But just as the tension seemed to reach its breaking point, another voice, this time from the back of the store, interrupted. Is there a problem here? Everyone turned, and for a moment the crowd collectively froze. Standing in the doorway was a tall, well-dressed woman in her early 40s, her expression stern. She was the store manager, and it was clear from the way she walked that she was used to taking control of situations. She had the air of someone who commanded respect, but there was a softness to her gaze that suggested she was fair-minded, not quick to judgment. Because if there's a problem, she continued, her eyes narrowing at the scene in front of her, I'll have to ask you to leave. The room fell silent once again. Mark's face tightened as he recognized the manager. He knew he was on thin ice, but his pride refused to back down. Tom, on the other hand, seized the moment to speak, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of everything that had happened up until now. Yes, Tom said, his eyes fixed on the manager. There is a problem. And it's not just with this guy. He nodded toward Mark. It's with how people like him treat others based on assumptions, on judgment. It's not just about the coins the woman was using. It's about treating her like she doesn't matter, because she doesn't fit some arbitrary standard. But she does matter. The manager's eyes softened. For a moment she said nothing. She simply looked at Tom, processing what he had said. Then, with a deep sigh, she turned to Mark, her expression now colder. Mark, go to the back. I'll handle this. The room seemed to exhale collectively as Mark, for the first time in the entire exchange, didn't argue. He simply turned and walked toward the back of the store. His shoulders slumped, a subtle admission of defeat. Tom's gaze softened as the tension finally started to dissipate. He hadn't solved the problem yet, but he had shifted the balance. And for now that was enough. The tense silence in the store seemed to stretch on, like a rope pulled taut between two opposing forces. The manager, now standing resolute, had just sent Mark to the back, but the damage lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. Tom stood still, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes trained on the elderly woman who had become the center of this drama. She had made her purchase, but her expression was distant, almost vacant. It wasn't just the coins that had humiliated her. It was the way she had been treated, the indignity that came with being judged by a young man who had no clue what she had lived through. The manager, now in charge of the situation, took a step toward Tom. She glanced toward the back where Mark had disappeared, and then back at the woman. Are you all right? She asked softly, her voice almost apologetic. The elderly woman's gaze flickered, as if she were surprised that anyone had taken an interest in her. She nodded faintly, but there was a tremor in her hands as she adjusted her coat. Her eyes darted nervously to the door, as if she was ready to leave but couldn't quite bring herself to. I'm fine, she whispered, but the fragility in her tone made Tom's heart ache. The store manager exchanged a glance with Tom, her expression softening as she realized the woman had been deeply affected by the incident. I'm sorry for what happened, she said, looking genuinely remorseful. Mark's behavior was unacceptable. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again. Tom nodded, but didn't reply immediately. Instead, his eyes followed the elderly woman as she slowly walked toward the exit. He wanted to say something more, something that would ease the pain in her eyes, but the words wouldn't come. There was nothing to say that could undo what had already been done. The damage was more than just the cruel words. It was the disregard for her humanity, the belief that her worth was tied to the coins in her hand. Suddenly, a loud voice broke through the heavy silence. Hey, you can't just walk out without saying anything. The voice belonged to Mark, who had returned to the front, his face red with anger. His posture was stiff, and his words were slurred with frustration. You think you can just walk out without apologizing for making a scene? He stepped forward, clearly itching for a confrontation. But this time, Tom could feel the change in the air. Mark wasn't in control anymore. His bluster had become a shield, and the shield was crumbling. The elderly woman stopped in her tracks, her frail form trembling as Mark's words landed like punches. She turned slowly to face him, her back slightly hunched from years of hardship. For a moment, she seemed smaller than ever, like the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders. But then something in her shifted. It wasn't anger. It wasn't bitterness. It was the quiet resolve of someone who had lived long enough to see the worst of people, and had learned how to navigate it. Tom watched as she raised her chin just slightly, meeting Mark's gaze for the first time with an unwavering calm. You don't know me, she said softly, her voice barely audible, but the weight of her words struck harder than any shout. You don't know my story, so don't stand there pretending you have the right to judge me. Mark recoiled slightly, taken aback by the woman's sudden strength. For the first time, he wasn't dealing with a helpless figure he could easily push around. Her words were like a mirror, reflecting back the arrogance that he had carried with him all this time. His face flushed deeper, but he didn't back down. I don't care what your story is. All I know is you're wasting my time. And for the last time you... But he was cut off by a voice that, for the second time that day, made everyone freeze. Enough! Tom's voice cut through the tension like a blade, calm but resolute. His presence seemed to magnify the weight of the moment, drawing all eyes to him. Mark faltered, his words dying in his throat as Tom stepped forward, his gaze steady and piercing. "Mark," Tom said, his voice low but firm, "you've made your point. But now, it's time for you to listen. You don't know this woman. You don't know what she's been through. And more importantly, you don't understand the lesson you're failing to learn here. It's not about coins, it's not about your ego, it's about humanity." For a brief moment, Tom thought Mark might respond with a snide remark or a defensive retort. Instead, there was something about Tom's tone, something about the weight of his words, that made Mark pause, a flicker of doubt crossing his features. The crowd too seemed to shift. They were no longer passive observers, but active participants in the story unfolding before them. There was a subtle but noticeable tension in the air, as though the room had collectively realized that this moment wasn't just about a customer and a cashier. It was about something bigger, something deeper. Tom took another step forward, his voice growing more intense with each word. "You might think you're better than her because you have a job, or because you have some power over her in this moment. But I'm telling you now, you're wrong. She has lived a life of experiences you can't even begin to imagine. And you owe her an apology, not because she's weak, but because you're the one who's failed to see her for who she truly is." Mark's face twisted, caught between pride and confusion. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. For the first time, he was confronted with a truth he couldn't escape, a truth that made the edges of his arrogance crack and splinter. The elderly woman, however, remained silent. Her expression didn't change, but her hands were no longer shaking. There was a dignity in her quiet response, a knowing strength that Tom could sense without even looking directly at her. Mark glanced at the manager, as though waiting for her to intervene to back him up. But instead, she stood back, her arms crossed, a slight but resolute shake of her head signaling her support for Tom. The room held its breath. The turning point was here. Mark's chest heaved, his fingers clenched at his sides. And then, without warning, his defiance crumbled. His shoulders slumped, and his head dropped slightly, as if the weight of everything had finally hit him. He muttered something under his breath, something too quiet to catch. But it didn't matter. His pride had been shattered in front of a crowd, and there was nothing left to prove. Tom stood there, a quiet resolve in his eyes. He had done what he could. He had stood up for what was right, for the human dignity that Mark had forgotten, and for the woman who had suffered silently for far too long. But this wasn't just about this moment. It was about the bigger picture. The small actions we take every day, the words we speak, the judgments we make. Tom knew that the ripple effects of this moment would continue long after the scene in the store had ended. And just as the moment began to settle, a final, unexpected twist lay just ahead. The room held its breath. Mark stood there, his gaze averted, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The weight of Tom's words hung in the air, making the previously bustling market feel strangely quiet, as if time had paused to witness the shift that was happening. The elderly woman, whose hands had stopped trembling, turned toward the door once again, as though ready to leave. But her pace was slower now, more measured, as if she were no longer fleeing, but instead walking with a quiet dignity that had been reclaimed. Tom watched her for a moment, his mind racing. It had all happened so quickly, and yet, there was a sense of finality in the air. He knew that the battle wasn't over, not yet. There was still the matter of Mark, still the shadow of his arrogance lingering in the room, still the question of what would come next. He glanced over at the store manager, who had stood by silently, observing the confrontation. She was watching Mark now, as though she too had been waiting for this moment. The moment when he could no longer hide behind his defensiveness. "Mark," she said, her voice cool and calm, "you're going to apologize, and I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Mark's face reddened again, but this time there was a difference. The defiance that had once fueled his anger had faded into something more like shame. His shoulders sagged as if the fight had been drained from him, and in that moment, Tom saw a glimpse of the man beneath the bravado. A person who had been so used to feeling superior that he didn't know how to handle humility. Tom didn't look away. It's not just about apologizing. It's about changing. It's about learning to see people for who they really are, not who we think they should be. Mark swallowed hard. He opened his mouth to speak but closed it again, unsure of how to respond, unsure of what could be said to undo what had already been done. The crowd around them had grown quieter still, sensing that this was the pivotal moment, Mark's moment of reckoning. The elderly woman reached the door, but before she could step out, she stopped. Slowly, she turned back toward the scene unfolding in front of her. Her eyes met Tom's, and in them, he saw something he hadn't expected: understanding. Not sympathy, not pity, just understanding. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You've given me my dignity back." Her words were a balm to Tom's heart, but they were also a reminder of how fragile dignity could be, and how easily it could be stripped away by the careless words of others. Without another word, she stepped out of the store, leaving behind a quiet space that felt different somehow, lighter, more aware. Mark was still standing there, his eyes locked onto the ground. The manager looked at him once more, then at Tom, as if seeking confirmation of what should come next. Tom took a deep breath, knowing this was the critical moment for both Mark and the store. Whatever happened next would shape their paths, perhaps forever. Finally, Mark muttered something barely audible, his voice thick with regret. "I'm sorry," he said. I shouldn't have done that. I was wrong." It wasn't much, but for Mark it was enough. The arrogant edge that had once defined him had disappeared, leaving behind a broken man, yes, but also someone who had been given a chance to change. Tom nodded, offering him a quiet acknowledgement. "It's never too late to do better," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of the lesson he had imparted. Mark nodded, his eyes still downcast, as if processing the enormity of his realization. And with that, the conflict reached its turning point. The arrogance had been broken, the dignity of the elderly woman had been restored, and the seeds of change had been planted in Mark's heart. Now it was time for the resolution. The store was quieter now. The bustle of customers had resumed, but the energy was different. It wasn't just the usual noise of casual shopping and small talk. There was an undercurrent, a quiet shift that seemed to reverberate through every corner of the store. It was as if the building itself had absorbed the weight of the moments that had just transpired. The conflict had resolved, but it left something behind, something lasting. Tom watched as Mark lingered near the counter, shifting uncomfortably under the manager's steady gaze. It was obvious to Tom that the young man was grappling with his own internal battle. He was ashamed, but there was a flicker of something else in him, something that told Tom this experience would haunt him, in a way that would shape him for years to come. It wouldn't be the first time Mark had to confront his arrogance, but it was likely the most humbling. The manager, who had been standing by with arms crossed, now approached Mark with a softer expression. Her words were calm but firm. "You'll do better, won't you?" Mark nodded, though he still couldn't seem to meet her eyes. "Yeah," he muttered. "I will." The manager's face softened just a little, acknowledging his effort. "Good. I'll expect you to do better from now on. Not just here, but everywhere." The silence that followed was filled with quiet reflection. Tom could tell that the store had become a kind of mirror, reflecting back the lessons of the day. Mark's arrogance had faltered under the weight of compassion, and it had exposed a side of him that he likely wasn't used to acknowledging. But this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. As Mark retreated to the back, the manager turned toward Tom. She looked at him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. "I've seen a lot of things in my time here," she said slowly, her voice thoughtful. "But I've never seen someone turn a situation like that around so quickly." Tom gave a small shrug, his eyes thoughtful. "It wasn't just me. The real change happened when people started listening to each other. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to remind us that everyone has a story. That's the lesson Mark needs to learn." She nodded, clearly reflecting on his words. "I think you're right. He's got a lot to work on. But maybe this will be the wake-up call he needed." Tom didn't respond immediately, instead turning his attention back to the door. He knew that the woman who had been humiliated earlier had already left. There was no grand goodbye, no dramatic speech. She had quietly reclaimed her dignity and walked out of the store, leaving behind a trail of change in her wake. He couldn't help but admire her strength. She had been so quiet throughout the ordeal, but in the end, it was her silence that had spoken the loudest. Her resilience, The way she had carried herself with quiet grace despite everything was something Tom would remember long after this day. As Tom stepped toward the exit, he spotted her across the parking lot. She was walking slowly, but there was no longer any sign of hesitation or fear in her step. Instead, she moved with purpose, her head held high, as though she had shed the weight of an invisible burden. Tom watched for a moment, wondering what had been going through her mind during the entire ordeal. Did she feel the sting of Mark's words? Or had she, like so many people, become so used to being overlooked and underestimated that it no longer affected her? Either way, she had handled herself with a dignity that was far more powerful than any insult. He made his way toward her, feeling a strange pull to make sure she was okay, to offer some kind of support, even if it wasn't necessary. As he approached, she turned, recognizing him from the earlier exchange. She smiled softly, a small but genuine curve of her lips. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice warm but weary. "But thank you. It means more than you know." Tom returned her smile, feeling the weight of her words. "I think you did the hardest part. You stood your ground. That's the real strength." She nodded slowly, as if processing his words. "Sometimes it's not easy, but you're right. It's not about how much we have, or how we're treated in the moment. It's about remembering who we are and holding on to that, no matter what." Tom regarded her for a long moment. There was something so simple, and yet so profound in her words. In a world that often valued wealth and status over kindness and character, she was a reminder that the true measure of a person wasn't in their possessions, but in their ability to rise above the noise and stay true to themselves. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. She gave a small laugh, shaking her head. "I'll be all right. Life goes on. We just have to keep going, even when the world seems to be pushing against us." Tom looked at her, feeling a sense of gratitude for this brief but meaningful encounter. It was clear that she had been through much in her life, far more than most people would ever understand. But she had carried herself with a quiet strength that spoke volumes. "Well, if you ever need anything," Tom began, but she cut him off. "Thank you, but I think I'll be fine," she said, her voice warm but resolute. "You've done more than enough already. Sometimes, just knowing someone's out there listening makes all the difference." And with that, she turned and continued on her way, her footsteps steady and sure. Tom watched her go, feeling the weight of the lesson she had imparted. He had come to the store that day thinking he might be a passive observer, just another customer in a line. But what he'd found was so much more. A moment of truth, a confrontation with arrogance, and a reminder of the quiet heroes who lived among us, their strength often unseen, but always present. As he turned to leave the parking lot, Tom couldn't help but smile. He had learned something important too. Strength wasn't always about standing tall or making grand gestures. Sometimes it was about having the humility to listen, the courage to speak up when it mattered, and the grace to step aside when someone else needed the spotlight. And in that moment, he knew the world was full of quiet heroes, people like the elderly woman, like Mark, and even like himself. They were all just waiting for the right moment to step forward, to show their true strength. As Tom stood in the parking lot, his thoughts still swirling from the events of the day, he couldn't help but feel a sense of completion. It was one of those rare moments when everything, however small, seemed to align. Mark had been given a chance to change, the elderly woman had reclaimed her dignity, and even the manager had witnessed how a simple act of standing up for what was right could ripple outward, affecting everyone involved. In the days that followed, things in the store began to change. Mark, though still finding his way, took small steps toward becoming more mindful. He greeted customers with a politeness he hadn't shown before, his interactions softer, less impatient. He even approached the elderly woman, who had become a regular customer in the weeks after the incident. She greeted him with the same quiet dignity, but Tom noticed a change in her as well. Her interactions with Mark were kind but direct. There was no room for pity, only a shared understanding of the lessons learned. Tom, for his part, didn't return to the store. He didn't need to. He had done what he felt was necessary, and now, the story had woven its own conclusion. However, he couldn't shake the sense of fulfillment that lingered. He had witnessed the power of compassion in action, the way a single moment could shift the trajectory of not just one person's life, but several. It was a reminder that sometimes it wasn't grand gestures that changed everything. It was the quiet, unnoticed moments that mattered the most. The elderly woman's life went on, and though her daily struggles were far from over, she carried with her a sense of quiet strength that had been forged in the fires of humiliation and redemption. She had been torn down, yes, but she had risen, and in doing so, she had unknowingly taught everyone around her about the true meaning of resilience. As for Mark, his journey was far from complete, but Tom could feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere when he thought about him. The arrogance hadn't disappeared completely, but it had been humbled in a way that could never be taken back. Mark was forced to confront his own assumptions about the world and the people in it. That kind of change didn't happen overnight, but it started with a single moment, a humbling, eye-opening experience that Tom had unknowingly set in motion. Tom's reflections were interrupted by the sound of his phone vibrating in his pocket. A message from his agent. It was a gentle reminder of the work waiting for him on the horizon. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to rush toward it. He allowed himself a moment of peace, remembering that it wasn't always about the next big project or the next big achievement. Sometimes, it was about the quiet acts of kindness and humility that changed the world in the most unexpected ways. As he slid into his car, ready to move on to the next chapter, he couldn't help but smile. The world might not always notice the small acts of goodness that happen in the shadows, but they were always there, shaping lives and creating ripples that would eventually touch every corner of existence. He had learned that lesson firsthand, and as he drove off into the horizon, he carried with him the knowledge that in some small way, he had helped make the world a better place.